Muir. Yeah, excellent. Thanks very much. And without further ado, as Des says, I'll answer the question. And I think the simple answer is yes. Rewilding is not a new term. It's been around for at least 20 years, and particularly in the United States. But actually, as a method, rewilding has probably been practiced even longer. In Britain, probably since 1951, the start of the first National Nature Reserve at Ben A, and it carries on in different guises through Craigmeddy, Glenfeshie, Carrifford, and some of the names in Scotland that you'll be familiar with. As a term, it's controversial, within and without conservation. What does it mean? What does rewilding mean? Where is it going? Are we trying to recreate the past? Will big scary animals be brought back? What about people? How do people fit into rewilding? How much do we intervene? But then, conservation is always controversial. Effectively, conservation, in my mind, is about putting nature first and man second, and many people don't like that. A lot of people, particularly powerful people, believe the earth and its natural resources exist solely for man's benefit. Conservation has evolved over the years. We had a focus in my early career on species, then it's moved on to habitats, ecosystems, and I just think rewilding is a natural progression. And in each case, farmers, fishermen, developers, hunters, they don't have been resistant. And at the same time, I would argue nature has continued to be damaged and developed and depleted. For me, therefore, arguments over definition are not important. The NGO I work for, the John Muir Trust, uses the term wild land. It's controversial and causes endless debates, particularly in Scotland in relation to the legacies of clearances and rural development discussions. But after 30 years of the Trust's existence, wildland has finally become mainstream, at least in Scotland. This year it's embedded in Scottish planning policy, and I'm hoping rewilding will be the same, but hopefully much quicker this time. What's more important for me than a definition is the concept. Rewilding is about creating a richer, wilder world for nature and people. It's a term that's ability to engage with lots of people and make conservation and enhancement of our environment exciting and mainstream. Recently there was an event in Edinburgh, and George Monbiot and Alan Watson-Featherstone gave a debate on the issue here. And there were 600 people attended, and 200 couldn't get tickets. And I think that shows there's a groundswell of interest in this subject. I also think rewilding is a counter to the bleak Anthropocene neocon conservation movement we have, and it's of capitalising natural resources and seeing nature purely in terms of how much it's worth for man. This trend is growing. Our own dear Scottish Natural Heritage's latest draft corporate plan talks about a vision where, and I quote, "People value Scotland's natural assets because they generate benefits." Isn't that a bit depressing? Is that all it's about? What about the beauty and wonder of nature? I think rewilding offers a more positive view. It's about letting nature have some space. There's an overlapping movement which is called Nature Needs Half, which some of you may have heard of. In Scotland's case, 10% would be nice. 10% of the land not under our current intense management, where every square metre is burned or grazed to the bone by sheep or deer, where raptors are illegally persecuted, where woodland only survives behind 6-foot-high deer fences, and where we have virtually no natural tree line or montane scrub. So for me, rewilding offers a new way to restore and enhance our trashed land whilst engaging people with the thrill of the wild. In practical terms, rewilding can be summarised in 3 C's: cores, corridors, and carnivores. Core areas where nature holds sway. Corridors are green networks linking these areas and urban areas to them. And carnivores, the keystone species that are essential components of true natural ecosystems. So I contend, and I firmly believe, that rewilding is an essential tool in effective nature conservation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For your presentation, thank you very much, Mike. I'd now like Andrew to come forward from Scottish Land and Nature.
Thank you, Des. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I have a chance to come directly back on some of those things, but I'll stick with what I was hoping to sort of offer as an introduction. So I'm Andrew Midgley, I work for Scottish Land and Estate. So I represent members of our organisation, landowners across Scotland, and we have a range of members. They range from owner-occupier farmers to large estates. They range from private owners through institutional owners to community owners. And they range from people doing different sorts of activities, from being solely farmers to having very diverse, wide businesses. So we also include in our membership people who specifically have as their sort of main management objective rewilding or ecological restoration. So we have a very broad, diverse membership. Although, having said that, within that membership there are plenty of people whose management objectives also sort of come into clash with those people that are interested with rewilding. So it's an interesting place to be. In general, if you think about the question, to what extent do I think that rewilding is an essential tool? I'd say, well, it depends. It depends what we mean by rewilding, because that's such a broad issue, such a broad topic, and it actually depends on what we mean by nature conservation. So let me start at one end of the spectrum, at the sort of absolutist end, where we're talking about large-scale reintroductions. Even in Scotland, where we do have large land holdings, achieving an area that's sort of large enough to have the reintroduction of large predators, to create functioning ecosystems, has its practical problems. We do have an existing structure of land ownership, and people manage for different reasons, and suddenly we get into really difficult clashes of motivation, of interest, and therein lies one of the key problems. You hit upon these when you talk about reintroductions anyway. But please, I would like to give you a personal view as well. It's a slight tension between, I can give you the Scottish Land and Estates view and a personal view, and this is a personal comment. With regard to the absolutist view of rewilding, I have a slight issue with it in the sense that if we think we're in and I think we are in a period of environmental crisis, and that crisis comes about because of how we have constructed our place in the world in terms of our relationship to nature and culture. Over time, we have created ourselves as distant from nature, and so that separation of nature and culture is one of the root causes of our environmental crisis. One of my issues with rewilding, in this sort of very extreme sense, is more to do with the fact that actually that perpetuates the problem, because it puts nature over here. It doesn't provide us with resources to live with nature, to find ways as humanity to live with rather than at the expense of nature. What I'm looking for are conceptual resources, practical ways that we can have people making a living and we can have a vibrant and enhanced nature. So, if we come down a level, if we're thinking about rewilding as sort of enhancing the ecological sustainability of current land management, so this is actually sort of allowing nature back into what it can frequently be very intensive forms of management, and Mike's already referred to a few of those. If we're thinking about that as rewilding, then we're back into the realms of changing policy. We're into the realms of actually what mechanisms can we come up with that enable us to allow nature back in. And George Monbiot hit upon actually changing the cap. Now, he specifically sort of honed in on changing the geek rules around London grazing, and I don't agree with him on that, but I do actually agree that if we do want to find ways of allowing nature back in, we probably do have to look for radical reform. And as an organisation, Scottish Land and Estates has been arguing for a long time that we need food and environmental security because they're dependent on each other. And so we would, for one, will continue to argue for that reform of the cap. Then finally, I'll just finish on a point about rewilding and nature conservation as a practice. For very good reasons, nature conservation is based on science. It collects data to enable us to know what's going on, to enable us to inform action so that we can do something about the problems that we've identified. But this process of scientization, bureaucratization, the rationality that goes with nature conservation, potentially is not such a problem, but there is an issue with it. And Bill Adams identified an issue. He said there's a potential conflict in conservation that's based on ideas of nature and practices of engagement with nature that are driven by the same rationalist project that's generated the damage that conservationists wish to oppose. And I have a lot of sympathy with that. Where is the beauty? Where is the placefulness, the connectedness with in the world? And if rewilding does anything, if it brings those concepts to the fore, then that will actually be a very good thing. So to finish, I would say And I have to refer, I guess I'm speaking from a Scottish context, and I know the audience is wider than that, but in Scotland there is a big issue at the moment around land reform, and landowners tend to be seen as the blockage to the problem. They are the problem that need to be removed in order to move towards a system where we actually have a different form of land use, different land management. And I would say that if we operate on a basis of like the simple stereotypes, then we lack something here. Things are always more complicated. We have people who are really interested in this field, and I think that actually there is lots of scope for rewilding. We just need to work together to be able to work out the best ways to do it.
Excellent, thank you, Andrew. Very clear presentation again. Probably to hear the word beauty being used rather than some of the dry language you hear associated with this important term. Now, Philip, I'd like you to come forward, give your presentation. Philip, you wear several hats, and you're going to give us an experience of working with the National Nature. Come this way.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for the invitation to stir things up a bit. Along with sorry, as the Chairman said, I have responsibility for managing an NNR, National Nature Reserve. It's the UK's only privately owned, privately managed National Nature Reserve. But I say private, I hate the word private because it's so often private keep out. I only say private to distinguish it from publicly owned. And in fact, we welcome 15,000 visitors a year to our nature reserve. I say welcome. Now, where I come from, and thank you very much, I'm a long way from here, about as far as I can get, on the marshes in southeast England. In fact, on a very clear day, I could see your oldest ally, Chairman, on a very clear day, that country. I listened to your minister this morning, and I did pay particular attention to what he said about rewilding. It seemed he was sitting on pretty much a fence about the size of Hadrian's Wall, it seemed to me. But I have understandings of ministerial difficulties on issues like this. But rewilding, it seems to me that, a bit like Lewis Carroll, Alison, or Through the Looking Glass, rewilding, words can mean what they want. You to me. It could be rewilding to someone who leaves a bit of his lawn unknown, or someone who wants to create another Yellowstone National Park, and everything in between. But perhaps the best definition I've come across is, and now let me read this, and I thought this was rather good, to allow natural ecological processes to resume, and that seemed a pretty clever definition. But that's not so easy in a lot of the crowded UK. Just onto the photo behind you, that's our Elmley National Nature Reserve in winter in January. And it looks wild, it looks a wilderness, it looks natural. And that's the impression we want to give our visitors, and that's the impression we hope they'll take away. But, and that's it, an aerial photo. But it isn't natural. When you get back to May, we've got the largest population largest concentration of breeding waders in lowland UK. And these onto that, and then that, and that. But we do it through mechanisms like that. It was all arable land in Victorian times, and First World War, Second Motor, and then we use mechanisms like that. But we do that to create, that's it in the summer, of course, the grazing marsh, sucker cows, the lapping of veg, but we do that to create that back again next winter, and that's dusk in probably December, January, February. So my point is that we create an impression of wilderness through intensive conservation management. And I am much interested in natural processes. 30 years ago we fenced off 3 areas, and apart from very occasional intermittent grazing by sucker cows to sort of simulate what might have happened naturally, what has happened, the sea club rush colonised it first, the Scarpas, then that was followed by the common reed, the Phragmites. But biologists tell me both of those are less interesting for conservation provide less biodiversity benefits than extensively managed low and wet grassland. But of course, if we want really to rewild it, we knock down our sea wall, as we heard this morning. I mean, it's all artificial, protected from high tides by the sea wall. But once again, biologists tell me, conservation tell me, that salt marsh would provide less biological diversity than, once again, conservation managed low and wet grassland. So my real message is that we want to give our visitors an impression of wilderness, wildness, natural processes, when in fact it's nothing of the sort. But they do seem to be very happy with it. And that they are members of the public who are ultimately paying to do it through environmental stewardship, HLS, high-level stewardship. And we do have to keep the public on side. So that's really my message and what I'd like to take away today.
Thank you. Excellent. Again, thank you, Philip. That's 3 very clear presentations. Do you want to see if we can fix the mic? I need to jump up and down. I should say you referred to the minister who's sitting on a fence. And the ministers are always fond of saying, if you sit on the fence, you can see much further. Always across a barbed wire fence. Now, what I thought we'd do, having spoken with our speakers, is let's get your views. We've got no big mics. Let's talk first about the concept. I thought Mike at the outset articulated the concept beautifully clearly. Talk about that, then let's hear your views about rewilding, and then let's move forward into thinking about how we can make rewilding happen. So what about the concept? Does anyone want to comment on the concept? And be warned now, there are people here I will point to. Dick?
I think the concept is good, but I think the scale which Scotland needs is far greater than any one individual area being treated in this concept. And the Minister mentioned this land use strategy across Scotland. But when you look at Scotland and you see the amount of land that is now devastated, absolutely devastated, through overgrazing, overburning, and overuse, extractive policies that are still going on. And until such times as we increase the number of people that are involved through communities, people who have been divorced from the land for a long, long time, since the beginning of the 18th century, certainly, divorced from the land completely. We're going to get people back in there, and somehow or other we have to get them involved in a way that is economic and is beneficial to wildlife and people. Because at the moment, much of the land that we're talking about still remains devastated, and something has to be done on that scale.
Excellent, Dick. So your point there is wildland should have people. People should be a part of it rather than thinking of empty, devastated landscapes where we might have visitors but no one living and working there. Philip, do you want to respond to that?
Well, I fully agree. I believe that it's absolutely crucial to keep public opinion and political opinion on board. We have to make areas of conservation, whether they're wildland or not, we have to give public access, because I hate the old idea of SSIs or national nature reserves where they were, sorry Chairman, sort of playgrounds for scientists 50 years ago. We just have to make them accessible, and a few of you may know Professor Bryn Green, Professor of Conservation at Imperial College. He always said that sites of special scientific interest, SSI, shouldn't be called sites of special scientific, they should be called sites of spiritual inspiration, because it's in here, and I believe that's very emotive for a lot of people. So I'm with you 100%. Public access, managed public access, managed public is crucial.
Okay, Andrew?
Is this working? Yeah. I think it goes further than that. So it's not about access. At the moment in Scotland, Dick refers to how there is the vast, large areas of land that are devastated. And at the same time, there is a debate going on about land reform. And the crux of the issue goes much further than access, in the sense that it's about how to balance the public and private interest. At the moment, Dick would say, presumably, that the balance is more towards the private interest because it's about extractive land use for a particular individual who's the owner or manager. But the whole debate in Scotland is moving much more towards how do we ensure that land is managed much more broadly so that it delivers in the public interest. And that is right at the heart of the current debate. And the direction of the land use strategy is along the lines of trying to find ways through which communities, people that live in places anywhere in Scotland, certain people live in communities where land use affects them in some way. And the tenor of the land use strategy is that those people should have more of a say because it affects their lives. And I think, so I'm speaking on behalf of Scottish Land Estates, we as an organisation are supportive of the land use strategy. We just want to try and secure a way of it working that is constructive, so that people get into dialogue about the sorts of future that they want in their area, so that the landowner can help deliver that. At the moment, communication between the different interests is poor. And that's something that we, on the landowning side, have to rectify. We have to find a way that is constructive so that we deliver both. And I think there's still a way to go, but the land use strategy might be a step in the right direction.
Okay, I'm keen to hear from a number of people here. I suspect we've had long debates with Dick on this very point, but I'd like to sort of push you a little bit. So Dick's made the plea for people to be part of wildland. Is that really the view of your address? Do you see one of that with community people? Development even?
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's a bit of a false dichotomy here that we are part of nature, you know, so the idea that somehow you've got, we're all talking about there about private interest and public interest. I mean, we all depend on nature for water, for fresh air, and I think what we're arguing in Scotland, when we're talking about devastated land, is that a lot of the land is reduced to a two-dimensional monoculture of whether it's heather or ammonia. Much richer environment in terms of woodland and all the forest products that go with it. You'd be able to sustain a lot more people living in the land as well as a lot more biodiversity. So I don't think it's. I think we always see things from our point of view as humans, and certainly that's the job we were trusting all our NGOs as far as aware of our very, you know, we all got open access. We welcome people. We're delighted with people. We think people are part of need to be part of to get the movement going, as it were. But I think it's much more fundamental than that. I think it's a view of land that's as I say, 10% or somewhere, where actually natural processes are genuinely given their reign to do what they want, without us deciding it's designated for this or that. It's just about actually having a genuine natural process.
Okay, excellent. So can we see here, is there anyone who feels that wild land shouldn't have people? It should be just left, set aside for nature? Natural processes with a sort of fence or a line drawn around, and certainly people not encouraged to live there. Leaving aside, is there anyone with that view? Yes, Ian.
There's
newly ennobled fellow.
Thank you. I think there's very much a matter of scale to be put into this process, because I think Philip would be quite surprised if somebody suggested that 6 houses went on to Elmley and you had people living in the middle of the nature reserve there. So wildland and rewilding means a lot of different things to a lot of people. So rewilding could be turning a boring urban green space into something which is maybe got an element of semi-natural woodland in it. Rewilding could be remobilisation of sand dunes. It can be coastal retreat that we saw this morning and we see from Phil. In Scotland, it tends to that we think it tends to be that we think about the big upland and bogland areas. So there's lots of different concepts. And in some circumstances, people have got to be within that process. In other circumstances, they don't. And I think it probably it would help if we separated the concepts out in a sensible way. And I think Mike's last comment was a very helpful one, because I think the key to this, regardless of scale, is that what we're looking to do is to restore a number of the natural processes. We will fool ourselves if we think we can restore to what was there 100 or 200 years ago, because climate change and all sorts of other management factors will stop that happening. So maybe what we've got to do is concentrate on the functions and processes that we're looking for from the different habitats and the different ecosystems that we're looking to establish. And just one last point on that is that it might make sense to think that we monitor the features as a means of assessing whether we are developing those processes. Yeah. And the last point, while I've got the mic, I don't think we've got a good mechanism yet to achieve the societal choice for, I would call it restorative management, that people have been talking about on the podium. The decision making is still kept away from the people in large part, and if we're going to move in this direction, we've got to think about the way in which we bring society more directly into it. And if you're talking about societies in the far north of the Highlands, telling somebody you're going to rewild his land might not be met very favourably. If you talk about restorative management, it's a less pejorative term.
Okay, thank you, Ian. I think there you're absolutely right, Ian. Some of the landscapes, some of the sea cliffs, some of the salt marshes, even some of our wildest, most natural landscapes actually in the UK. But I wonder, so Ian, your plea is really stop obsessing about people being part of this landscape, whatever it is, but think about processes themselves, the ecological, the ecosystem processes.
Processes on scale.
Yeah. Mike, do you want to respond to that? You can simply agree or disagree.
I think I agree with most of that, yes. And I think I'd still argue that we're still looking at it from a very human-centric point of view. So yes, and I think so when you're talking about people in the Highlands having a choice about rewilding, well, we've got a whole cultural history there of the way the land's been managed and owned in the past. It means a lot of people are detached from the way the land ownership. I live in a village or outside a village in a rural area, and I'd say most people in the village don't have any, although they're living rurally, they don't actually have much contact with the way the land is managed at all or any input into that. So we've come a long way down from, so getting people involved in society, involved back into it is a big challenge because we've come so far from that. And people talk about the urban divide and people living in cities not knowing where meat comes from, all that kind of stereotype. But actually, rurally, in Scotland, there's quite a big divide too. So I think we've got a lot to break down first. But actually, it's about, and the other one we haven't talked about, marine ecosystem. If you talk about no-take zones in the marine ecosystem, and you talk about an area where it's a very small area where it's not managed in some way, and actually the productivity of that in terms of fish that's produced is much higher. We've got a similar thing on land. We don't really have an example to show where that works, but in the long term, that's going to be beneficial for everybody living in that area.
Good point. I'm going to bring some more people in. Go on, Joe.
Well, I would like to pick up the question the speaker asked from the back of memory. He did refer to Elmley and said, how would I like, or what would my views be if built half a dozen houses in the middle of Elmley? Well, that's just what we've done in the most recent years. We've set up ecotourism on an island in the middle of this, and you know the standard way that nature reserves seem to be, bog standard reserves seem to be managed. You know, you have a car park, you have loos, you had maybe a visitor centre, a notice board with the sort of rarities about, and then some hides. Well, people turn up at 10:30 and probably leave at 4 o'clock and have a jolly good day. But wow, what about if you stay overnight and you wake up to a view like that? You're really getting in amongst it. And so this is what we're providing now. And the response has been absolutely fantastic because we're giving people an experience they haven't had before. And perhaps I take a different view about people because I think we just to a certain extent, our ethic of land management is a stewardship ethic, and you know, that might sound a bit Old Testament, but I believe that we have a stewardship role where society, through government, pays us through things called environmental stewardship, HLS, all that sort of bureaucratic business. But essentially, we are paid as stewards to manage the nation's natural heritage. And the more exposure we can give them in an unusual, I think that's actually the right way to go.
Good. Thank you, John. Keep to hear from some more of you. Mike. Could we give Mike a mic?
Yeah, I think about 1 million hectares of Scotland's land surface is managed as intensive driven grouse manure. And as we all know, intensive manure practices and grazing is carried out on grouse manure land. And I think these practices prevent and inhibit natural processes from taking place, natural processes of vegetation succession, natural levels of predation and disturbance. Now, I think, how do you shift emphasis away from this obsession with burning and grazing towards allowing these natural processes from taking place? Should we be looking at more radical land reform to shift the power base away from the private sector to more towards a public sector, or at least allow a more diverse land ownership pattern to evolve in Scotland? Or can we rely perhaps on a cultural shift to take place within the sporting industry or the private landowning industry? And I would argue for the former.
Thank you, Matt. That's in no way a leading question. So essentially, you're saying these are aspects that are held in arrested ecological succession. Andrew, respond to that.
Yeah. Thanks, Mike. It's a fair question, and it's right at the top of political debate at the moment, because it comes back to this public-private. There's a large area of land that looks like it's being managed principally for private interest. Public interest is being overridden. That's what the issue is. How do we get there? I mean, I would obviously have to say that actually there is a a process that could take place. Let me say first of all that I think we're in a position at the moment where the different interests fight each other, and the sporting interest, whether that be from Scottish Land and Estates or from other organisations in the sector, tend to just defend as if everything is rosy. And I'll give you my view, which is that actually we need to acknowledge that the public interest needs to be more accommodated more clearly. And I think that we have to move the whole sector in that direction. If we don't, I think it's very clear that the government will legislate to force people to behave differently. And so our role as an organisation is to try and move in that direction. And we have been trying to do that because we've created Wildlife Estate Scotland as an initiative to try and get people thinking and managing with wildlife in mind. So I would say there's a collaborative process rather than radical land reform. I think there could be elements in there, parts of the toolbox, and Mike signalled that he didn't like this, but parts of the toolbox for me could be along the lines of ecosystem services and payments for ecosystem services. Because ultimately we have to remember that the land is being managed, whether to varying degrees, with income in mind. And if the manager can see that they're delivering a public benefit is actually also in his benefit or her benefit, ultimately we end up in a situation where we could be pulling in the same direction. At the moment we're not really, and I think we need to move that.
Okay, I'm going to look for shorter answers. Michael, when it comes to you, before I do Andrew, in that case, presumably from what you're saying, your organisation supports rewilding in some areas. It's actively promoting it?
So we're not actively promoting. If someone wants to this is what I was trying to do at the beginning. If someone wants to, if an owner wants to pursue rewilding as their principal management objective, great, good on them, defend their right to just do exactly that.
Rather than defending, would you encourage them? There's a difference between defending somebody and encouraging.
I think, so it depends, again, that's absolute rewilding, which is, that's my main objective. I think what we would encourage more clearly would be trying to find a greater accommodation of sustainability so that we enhance the ecological sustainability in what we're doing. In the rewilding of bringing nature back in sense rather than the complete, this is the primary objective.
Okay, so I know you're coming from, but I also know where Mike's coming from and can envisage some of these landscapes. Mike, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, so Mike, I think there's three factors. There's land ownership, there's incentives and regulation, and there's a culture. And I think all three of them need radical change, to be honest. I hear sort of core words and know the collaborative approach and everything, but we've tried that with lots of things over a long time, and it gets you so far. But I think the main thing is to have a system in place that sets out what the public objective is for a bit of land, and then it doesn't really matter who owns it, because then that's set in statute or whatever. So I think that's one thing. I think the ownership model, I think the more mixed up it can be better. So you've got NGOs owning land, you've got communities owning land, I think that has to be a good thing too. And then the culture is something that we come a battle against a lot of the time, because there's a very strong traditional Victorian culture in this country of hunting and shooting, which is really, you come up against a lot. And it's really interesting how that was created, that culture, and where it came from, and how, so there's a whole issue there. But I think those three things need to change radically to make any hope of changing the way the land is for rewilding.
Okay, Andrew, you want to come back briefly, and then I'll look for another question.
I just wanted to come back on the suggestion of identifying public objectives for land. It's perfectly reasonable in society that the reason we have laws is to protect the public interest. But if we get to the level where we've got land use planning at a very small scale, we end up beginning to impinge on the motivation for people for owning land. And actually, that's where we have to find the balance. Someone has to see something in it for them, because ultimately, it's a private interest that can drive things. Otherwise, the government has to pay for everything. We can't afford that.
Okay, I think that's also something that Ian was hinting at, and it's remarkable on scale. Now I saw some hands go up here. Two hands. Yes, first. Yes? Okay, the microphone, and then the lady behind you. The lady in front of you.
It's a question for Mike, really. I just wondered, I'm quite pro-rewilding, but I just wondered what the scope was for it in the UK, really, just because, I've gone to places in Romania and Hungary where, obviously you've got a lot more space, a lot less people. I just wondered if it is actually possible. I guess maybe in the Highlands you've got more of an opportunity for it, but I live in South East England, and the pressure for housing, development in all areas anyway, as it is, becomes quite overwhelming. I just wondered if there is any hope for it, really.
I think that's a very fair point, but I think that there's two answers to that. One is the scale that Ian referred to. Yes, we're talking about a Scottish scale rather than an Alaskan scale or an American scale or a UK scale we're talking about. But at the same time, partly Ian's answer as well, that there is, for example, there's a discussion at the moment about a national park for London, or a notional national park, and the concept of rewilding in urban areas. And I think you can have everything. So I think you can have, why do we spend all our time councils cutting grass all the time just to throw it away? There's a whole range of things from an urban point of view. But in terms of, as I say, there's the half for nature, I say, or 10% would be great. I'm sure we could find 10%, a quarter of 10% or 20% of the country where we could have a big rewilding restoration project. And we've got, so in theory it should be possible. But obviously, as Andrew's alluded to, the land ownership pattern we have, it's going to be difficult to make that happen in practice. But we've got national parks, we've got wildland areas now, we've got national scenic areas. There's hooks we can hang it on if the incentives and the regulation are correct. So I think it's definitely possible, but it's not without challenge.
Okay. John, do you want to react to that? Philip,
John? Yes. Not really. I don't. It's unusual for me not to want to say something, but I think I'd like to listen more to this debate. I think that the focus is on this area.
That's correct. I mean, I would reflect, I mean, you've got places like Dartmoor, they're wonderfully wild landscapes, ex-war. I mean, you don't have to be in the far north of Scotland or some of the remoter areas to experience these.
I mean, Chairman, perhaps my point is that in the crowded southeast, where the question came from, we have to come up with another solution of giving the public a wilderness experience. We're not getting, there's just no way you can do it in large scale. Charlie Burrell is doing it very interestingly on the Neff estate in West Sussex. And of course, but that's still a Wealdon farm with small fields that clearly is a very interesting experience, but it's not really a wilderness experience. He's getting some wonderfully interesting outcomes, but it's not a wilderness experience. And so I just think we've got to be a bit smarter in the crowded southeast to give you something that you think is valuable. I mean, I've got no problem at all with rewilding where it's appropriate, and I don't know Scotland at all, but if there's a glen that's all in big ownership and it can be done, I'd support Andrew. Well, if a landowner wants to do it, brilliant, well done him. Or if he wants to buy a great tract of Africa or whatever.
Great.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Philip. This is what I was hoping to get from you. You had a question, and then I'll come over here.
Is this working?
No.
Is that okay?
Perfect.
To what extent do you think this is a point you raised, Mike, about not having data, if you like, on the sort of economies of diversifying land ownership patterns and land uses, which might contribute to wilding of landscapes? To what extent do you think an economic argument might contribute to pushing this on a bit? I've seen figures cited for what you might regard as the gross domestic product of areas that have been community land buyout areas, where the GDP has effectively gone up and therefore makes a greater contribution to central funding, but also is a motivator, if you like. And then, Philip's talking about ecotourism possibilities, and you can see that those two might connect. Do you have a view that the economic argument might contribute positively to trying to push some of these things on a bit?
Yes, again, there's a mixed answer to that. I mean, I think on the one hand, we commissioned a study actually with NGO landowners from UHI and looked at you can't get exact comparisons of what was there before or whatever, but basically they stacked up very well, if not much better than traditional sporting shooting in terms of the number of employees they had, the amount of visitors they had, the designated sites, etc. So I think there is an economic case you can make, but I think it goes back to the caution I had at the beginning about the trend for natural capital and to try and make everything, try and monetize everything. I think that only tells part of the story. So certainly that's the language people speak in, and if you don't engage with that, you get left behind. But I think there's a much deeper language, like Philip's thing about SSSI or whatever. I think that we need to keep talking to that emotional feeling as well, and that whether it costs more or less, or whether it's better value or not, we have got a kind of ethical, moral responsibility to look after our planet and the developing planet. So I think we're just going to both really.
Which I should say was always in mind when the SSSIs were devised in the first place. It was very much the beauty of nature that was at the heart, actually, of establishing these areas. I'm keen to move us on. I'd really like us to move on to thinking about how we make this happen, how we realise this concept. I've seen two hands here. Penny first, ladies first.
My comment or question was actually very much on those lines, and it's to do with management. It seems to me that there's quite a divergence of opinion from the three speakers at the front here, going from some very intensive management to sometimes less management to no management or possibly no management. And I'd just like to point out, particularly on the basis of what Ian was saying about the scale and how widespread it could be in urban areas and so on, with small patches. Two things. One is I wouldn't like to say don't manage anything, just let it go, for two reasons. One is that we've got a lot of habitats which are cultural value, which were actually developed through cultural use one of which is actually Dwarfshire Peak. The other one would be Haymeadows, so there's lots going to be others. There's just two classic examples. You can't walk away from those and expect them to stay as they are, and you might not want to, but the value that you put on them in terms of their invertebrates, the diversity, whatever it is actually to do with that management. So you've got to make decisions as to whether you maintain some management in order to maintain that character of habitat in one place or another. And I don't think we should actually lose the cultural history value of some of those habitats and the archaeology, etc., that goes with them, which we could lose. And certainly the archaeologists hate trees, bracken, and all sorts of other things that will dig up their ancient monuments and things, badgers and rabbits, etc. as well. But I think we've got to put those into context. So if you're going to create wilding of some sort, can we actually have judicious management, which might be clearing conifers because you've got alien species coming in, it might be dealing with diseases of various sorts or invasions of various sorts. Don't lose the need for management.
But Penny, you know the Peak District extraordinarily well.
Yeah.
That's very heavily grazed.
No, not so much now.
No, it has been.
It has been.
Heavily polluted. Amazing peak formation.
22 million visitors a year.
Yeah. So let me push you. Is that a wild landscape? Does rewilding have a place there?
Only in the way that I have just said, yes.
So the landscape as I've described it, blanket bog, dwarf shrub heath dominated, that's your idea of a wild landscape?
We need some grazing.
So you need some grazing to stop what these tree seedlings taking food,
and also
parts becoming grassier. I'm just trying to push
you tend to get a dominance of some species at the expense of the greater diversity of others if you have no grazing, which has actually also been shown in the Orkneys on the heather, hasn't it? And Merricks couldn't get in to get their food.
Yeah. So what you're saying, I think, is you've got to be very clear about the objectives, your definition of wildness here, and how you're going to meet that goal.
I'm not suggesting the grazing has to be stock or managed stock. It could be deer, but then how do you manage the deer? And in the Peak District, I suspect large predators of the non-human sort might not be so appropriate.
I think we've given Mike a perfect intro there. Mike, you must wonder, do you manage deer?
I think there's multiple answers to that. The first point is, personally speaking, I think, the obsession with cultural history archaeology is fine, but that's not really our bag as an environmental NGO so much. So, I'm sure in 50 years' time we'll be looking at wind farms and saying they're fantastic cultural icons. You can take that back as far as you want, that's fine. I think, in terms of management, yes, we're in a very intensely managed country, so we don't have the predators, and therefore we have to manage the deer or the sheep or the grazing. So, in terms of wildlife management, let alone rewilding, we have to intervene and manage, and I think we all accept that to some degree. And I think, yes, there are cultural treasures that we have. There's ecological treasures that we have that require special management, and we have to accept that as part of it. We've got a designated system that does that for archaeology and for species and habitats. So I think we kind of accept that, that's a given. And maybe we can question it some of the time and whether it will stand up to climate change and all the rest of it. But I think in terms of the predator question, it's really funny. It's a bit like as I sort of do a wolf test every year. Now, if you ask people what they think of wolves, just to get an interesting knee-jerk reaction, and most people would call it horror. And then you think about, well, what are you frightened of, or what? You say you could never have them in the Peak District or whatever. I've been to bits of Spain, Slovenia, France, where there's wolves living in very urban edges or in rural areas, and you're far more in danger from a pit bull terrier or from tripping on the wrong type of slipper. So statistically, what we've got, the wolf debate is an interesting one. It's a long way off, and now I think everyone would recognise, but actually it's not very rational or logical. And so, again, everyone says they're happy with rewilding up to a point, and at what point are we happy with it? We're happy with a few more flowers in the garden, or are we happy with real trophic cascades? So we all draw a line in different places, but I think if we're serious about rewilding at some point, there's scary things coming, and we're going to have to talk about them.
Okay, Andrew, do you want to comment on this element of rewilding and the control of growing those?
In terms of your specific point, I would agree. We can't abdicate responsibility. We have to manage. The question then gets into how we balance the interests of different people, because over the landscape we do have different sets of interests and different motivations, and it's finding that accommodation. In terms of deer, for example, we have processes in Scotland that are underway. Similar sorts of issues are raised around stalking deer forest as grouse moors to a significant extent about the number of deer and the impact on the habitat. And the movement is to try and reduce deer numbers, get deer management plans in place over a large scale, and so we're moving in that direction. I think the same applies in terms of regulation. If government will intervene if things aren't sorted out in the very near future.
Okay, thank you. Philip.
I thought it was a very interesting point you made about the cultural history, the cultural management, and I'm big on that because, you know, when you look at a wildflower-rich meadow or the wonderful natural flora, or I say natural flora, of course it isn't natural flora, you know, it's been created through an extensive, fairly historic grazing process, and of course farmers weren't doing it to create wildflower meadow. Farmers historically were doing it to try and make money. So I mean, it's a rather long process. But I was on this. I was very, very interested when George Monbiot's book Feral came out, and I read it closely, and I was very taken with his conservation prison chapter, where he makes the point that, you know, much of conservation is stopping natural processes developing by intervening. Well, that's what we're doing, and I make no apology for that, because I just hope, I don't know the speaker there, but if it creates wonderful flower-rich meadows in the dales, to my mind, that's brilliant.
Yep, I'm sure many people will sign up to that. Yes.
I wanted to pick up something that Andrew said in his introductory remark, which was that the term rewilding can be a barrier, can actually prevent people engaging. And I think we've just had that from Mike with the Red Riding Hood story, that at least I'm old enough to have grown up with Red Riding Hood, and the wolf and the fear. I think there's something really important to pick up there, and I just wanted to throw in there again, this is the centenary of John Muir's death, as everybody north of the border will undoubtedly know, and I hope everybody's heard too. And one of my favourite quotes from John Muir is, not blind opposition to progress, but opposition to blind progress. And I think we can weave that into this argument here about what are we trying to do? Pick up the natural processes and enable natural processes. And Desi's question about putting lines around things and fences around things, that we're very stuck in that definition of land units. And actually, if we're going to move to processes, which I fully support, and get this moving forward, we've got to have people understanding and coming with us. The politics is really important. That sympathy, that engagement. And I think those processes, people fundamentally understand that they are part of the natural world, unless we're completely living on a different planet. And the process message, I think, is a really important one.
Can I, just before you hand over the microphone, can I push you a bit there? This term rewilding, which I have to confess, I don't like it because it's such an ambiguous term. I'm sensing from the discussion what we mean by it. Can you give us an alternative? And I'm going to ask some other people for an alternative term here. It's something we're obsessing about in Scotland at the moment.
I mean, it's something on the lines of reinstatement of natural processes, isn't it?
Right.
But,
restoration of natural
restoration of natural processes.
Restitution and restoration.
I think it's less threatening, but that's, I understand both. So, but again, rewilding is what you take to me, and we've heard that. Of course.
I know we've got some questions out the back. Does anyone want to respond to that? Mike? And then if we get a microphone up to the back.
I think, as I said, we've had, even from the trust, we've had endless debates about the term, and I think I'm more like the last remark, nobody knew what Hoover was when it was invented, and everyone talks about Hoover. I think you just have to get over that. I mean, it's a term, and it's not the term that's threatening, it's the concept that's threatening. So people are threatened by the concept, no matter what you call it. If you call it ecological restoration, natural processes, which we probably wouldn't get in the red tops, but I I don't know, I think we just have to keep discussing it and using it, and it'll become more acceptable. And already, as I say, already it's been used. If you saw there was something in BBC Wildlife about it recently, there's been debates, the term is out there, people are using the term rewilding, so I think we just have to define how we use it. But like sustainable, or like any of these terms, they mean different things to different people, but which is, but I think that's, in terms of conservation, we talk about rewilding. Yes, wild is wonderful and thrilling and scary and natural, but I'm quite comfortable with it.
Okay, thanks, Mike. There's nothing wrong with reviving nature, it seems fine. Now we've got people at the back. David, I think, if I can see you.
Hello, Adrian.
Adrian, sorry, I called you David, sorry.
Just a few points. I think some very relevant points being raised, and particularly about scale, culture, but it goes back to targets as well. I was involved with the Natural Heritage Zones project, which was a landscape appraisal for the Scotland and looking at ways forward, but particularly targeting landscape features on a national scale. I also take wildlife tours, and the wildlife tourism side of things really focuses the mind on, this inspiring nature, which I think is a really important feature, particularly in Scotland and the Highlands, where there are not so many. I suppose there's not a great variance of different types of work in communities. People have 7 jobs in some cases. But what I think we do need is, Mike mentioned carnivores, and I think it's really important to remember that, for example, wildcats are under great stress at the moment in terms of habitat, hybridisation, and their territories are very restricted. And if we're looking to really, really do something about trying to get landscape scale change for a species which is iconic and a target, we really should be setting out enough land for species like that. And it may be easier to target areas for those species, even though there's no SACs or other designated sites for them. They're incredibly important.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to flag some more remarks first. I've got one over here. There have been 2 hands up the back for a while, just behind you.
Hello, I am a big fan of rewilding, the concept and the word. I just think, thank goodness for this discussion, particularly as a consultant, to see so much development happening and just pandering to that really, and moving things out of the way and creating some very short-term, maybe not sustainable things in its place. I think it's funny that as ecologists that we're still thinking that with rewilding there would be forest throughout the land, not affected by climatic and soil and other factors that we have discussed, and that this is all going to be full of walls. And obviously that's kind of a very sort of limited idea of what it can be. And the other thing really is that we need to allow space for these wild areas, and if there's space then people can find them. We talk about reserves and children not having access to nature, but if there is space for it and it's there, they will find it. I don't think we have to say you're allowed to go here, here's a path, here's a sign. We just have to actually allow it to exist, and if we don't have these wild areas, how are we doing this regeneration? We're an island, there's not going to be anything to regenerate from. So if we're talking about that concept, then we have to have rewilding as well.
Yep. One better than maybe your neighbour would like to make one.
Hi, it's a comment question for Mike really. I suppose I'm interested in what your vision is for rewilding, and I suppose it varies depending on the situation, but how much intervention is it would be a part of your vision, and also how much exploitation of the sort of natural assets would you be prepared to consider or agree with to achieve that end? For instance, ecotourism, even hunting for wolves to allow them to prosper. Those kind of items. Yeah.
Okay, no pressure, Mike.
I think they're all fair. I think it's fair to say nobody's got the complete answer to that. I think the vision, if you like, is to have just to be a bit more relaxed about it all, let nature take its course. I think as we've touched on the intervention before, there's always going to be a fine line if you go anywhere in the world. If you go to Thompson National Park or you go to Yellowstone, there's interventions in these huge areas, and I think we just, ideally we wouldn't have that, but we are part of the system that we need to intervene at some point. So I think, again, there's interventions, but you'd have to think about that as it came up. in terms of the exploitation and the sustainable use of resources, again, there's nothing in principle wrong with that, and I don't think. And I think, you know, whether it's tourism, if you call that exploitation, I don't know, tourism is essential, people living there, extracting resources at some point. But I guess the only question would be whether within that area, in an ideal world, when you could zone something and have at least some area where you maybe didn't. That's maybe the way it sometimes works. But I know, for example, you know, people talk about, Roy Dennis has talked about a sacred mountain, the idea where you have a bit of land where nobody goes, and that's maybe not practical or possible in this country. But so in theory, I think everything you've talked about is absolutely right. There is no absolute, and there's a spectrum there. But perhaps at one extreme, you'd allow a little bit of you know, space maybe. But all the time you're going to have to be probably some sort of intervention. But moving towards a system of less and less, ideally.
I think that's good. You know, that's something that's very helpfully come out of the discussion, that local intervention. There's two hands going up here. Yes.
I have a question for all of the panel. Most of us live and work in urban areas. Everyone needs a daily dose of nature for their health and well-being. How do you take rewilding to the cities?
Okay, who would like to answer that? Philip.
Thank you, President. A presidential question. I guess we don't, in any sort of meaningful scale. I suppose in London, 9 Elms, you know, sorry, what wasn't, no, not Barn Elms, you know, the Wildfowl Wetlands Trust thing, that's probably the nearest you've got, but of course Richmond Park, that's pretty there. But I guess we're pretty fortunate that people can get, 8 million people from Greater London can get to us very, very quickly. So I think we do it the other way round. I think they come to get their dose of wilderness with us. I mean, the doctor doesn't come to you, you go to the doctor.
Okay, so Philip, you're saying there's one picture, even in the centre of the...
Well, I mean, once again, scale. I mean, somebody with a roof garden that's got honeybees and wildflowers on their roof garden, it's all a question of scale. Of course, I'm sorry, I'm not being clear, of course you can do it at any scale on a window box in your London flat. But if we're going to have more meaningful wilderness, then I think they have to come outside of urban areas, more larger scale.
Okay, I suspect David Good may have a view on that, he does, but we'll come to you, David. Yes, I'm mindful of time, so we'll move on quite quickly.
This isn't my area. I'll throw out a couple of ideas. I guess by rewilding the cities, what you're actually talking about is actually very simple, you know, in terms of closer engagement with, you know, more trees, more open space, more that's got a greater diversity of species in that space. So you instantly get into the rules that local authority planning departments have in terms of, you know, their planting strategies and things like that. And then potentially in terms of planning into the future, planning spaces into the environment in the way that we decide to zone things and whether we can create corridors and things like that.
Okay, thanks Andrew. Mike, I'm going to spare you commenting on the urban environment. Rob. Scottish voice about to be heard.
Again. Des, one of the things that I take a scientific approach, and my starting position is rewilding doesn't work. That's in the null hypothesis.
You are the head of experts,
no, this is a purely scientific thing. Rewilding doesn't work. That's your null hypothesis. Where's the evidence that it does work? And I'm quite happy to see it, and it becomes better. But what I think you should be doing, you know, someone who's well established in the SNH, you should be taking land and doing replicated experiments to see aggloma gradation from massive, as we have the land that's well managed, going right the way through to possibly in some sites where there is no management or no people other than the people who monitor, of course. Because until we've got good data, we will know what we're doing. We're just messing around. So really, we do need to get good data and properly organised surveys or monitoring or experiments. The advice was given to DEFRA to do exactly this for England and Wales
15 years ago, and it was totally ignored. I'd like to see something like this in place.
Good plug, Rob, and I remember even further back, you carried out a review of enclosed areas in Edinburgh, likely areas with little grazing. We were able to show the great benefits of having absence of grazing from some areas, but also in others have a small amount of grazing can benefit biodiversity. So I take your point.
That's true, but those were enclosures that we got on the hoof because they happened to be there for other purposes. They weren't there for in a planned way. And I think, I actually agree with Vic here, it needs to be big scale. Big scale. It needs to be at the estate level, or certainly the catchment level, maybe even many estates at the estate level, to look at a study.
Quick response from big scale, experimental approach, looking at the continuum. Andrew, you've got members to do it.
Yes.
Good, right, done. Philip?
Yes.
Yes, except I wasn't quite sure what you meant by the null hypothesis. So you were saying that natural processes, there's no evidence that natural processes work.
Well, there's no evidence that they're going to change.
Yeah, that's Rob's point. And they don't change in some areas. We're going to move on. David, did I see you putting your hand up at the back? And then I'm going to wrap up, giving each of our panelists 1 minute.
Yeah, can I just return to the urban situation that was raised by John Box? I think that there is something to do with philosophy and psychology which we're not talking about at all, and that rewilding in the city situation is to do with people's perception of nature. We're really talking about linking people, connecting with nature in their daily lives. There's no need for people to go out to Elmley from London. There are kids in London who've never seen the Thames, never seen the Thames, and they get their nature in the places where they live. Camley Street Park, that was created in the 80s by King's Cross, provided an oasis within which they were doing their pond dipping and all the things to do with nature in that situation. That's what we were trying to do, and that's a movement which has been extraordinarily successful in many towns and cities throughout Britain. And the urban spaces scheme in Scotland has been particularly effective in doing that kind of thing. We can't simply expect people to go out to the wild parts of the countryside somewhere. They've got to have something near their home.
Thank you, David. So connecting people with nature. There's a gentleman in front of you whose hand has been up, desperate to comment, then I'm going to go.
I heard a panel talking about having people's views, and Penny's mentioning that cultural heritage. The cultural heritage is important, but natural wild places are a part of our culture. Wild places are a part of our culture, and what better way is there to understand natural processes? You can't really understand natural processes unless you give them free rein, at least in some areas, and also you can't create it in complete isolation away from everyone, in a complete vacuum, and expect people to go and visit it just because you say it's there and that's what we should do with it.
Oh, good. Well, that's a very telling remark. Thank you. It's worth waiting for. Thank you. I want to go finally to our panelists just for any closing remarks before we break for tea, coffee. Philip, any reflections on this discussion we've had?
Well, Chairman, I think it's been really most interesting. I mean, I've learned a lot and it's made me think. I mean, I take the scale point, I take the culture point, I take the perception point. That's very strong with me. The perception of wilderness we're giving people. And don't forget, I mean, not my subject urban, but man, I think very often the culture of humankind is to subdue nature, to tame nature, and then go and live in the cities. Well, I'm not defending that, but I'm just saying what through history, what mankind has done. But just personally, I mean, I'm looking inside myself. I guess I come from a stewardship ethic, and I hope you don't think that's corny, do you follow me, or sort of overblown, but I see it trying to deliver environmental outcomes in the best way that society thinks it's done. But what I want to just end on, Chairman, I think the value of this, it makes us all think a bit more about what we're about, and if it does that, if it stops us for an hour and a half and makes us think and makes us reflect, and we remember it a week or two later, I think that's the huge benefit of a debate like this.
Well said. Thank you, Philip. Andrew?
Thank you. Something that we haven't necessarily touched on, but I want to emphasise, is that decisions about land use are effectively influenced by in lots of different ways. And one of or a few of the main ways are around things like public policy, financial incentive, common agricultural policy. If we want to see large-scale rewilding in that sort of middle ground sense that I was talking about in terms of improving the ecological sustainability of land use, if we want to see that, then we actually have tools to enable it to happen, because the people who are managing the land are driven to a significant extent by those sorts of drivers. We can see rewilding if we actually want to, by opting for reform of those tools. And so I think we can work together to deliver a form of rewilding which would be positive. It just depends how we do it.
Okay, thanks very much. I think I'd make a plea to just embrace rewilding and relax and let nature take a little bit of our planet, and just not to be frightened by things. We are part of nature, and we can live with it. So I think we need to embrace rewilding. I think it is going to be an effective and essential tool for nature conservation going forward.
Excellent, thank you. Well, look, I think with that, I'll draw proceedings to a close. I'd very much like to see it in practice a bit more thoughts and articles being given to the management side of this. How do we actually realise this ambition through management? It's quite a challenge there. Penny, you certainly got us thinking there. I want to close, first of all, by reminding you all that there are ballot boxes at the back, AGM coming up soon, so make sure you voted. I'm delighted, by the way, to see that our keynote speaker has arrived. I see him at the back looking very smart, which is excellent. But most importantly, would you please join me in thanking two superb panelists for that great stuff?